So we painted two leaves. We've used two techniques. This is wet on wet, and it's kind of drying in a way that's very visually interesting, I think, and also kind of realistic to what leaves actually look like. We've used wet on dry, and we use that big brush to practice control and see that you don't necessarily need a really fine tip brush to do some fine work. We painted a single layer, which is in the process of drying. One of the ways that I test to see if paint has dried is I touch it with the back of my fingers. And it's very cool, which means that this paper, even though light is not reflecting on it from being soaking wet, it's still wet, it's still in the process of drying. I'll probably be able to paint a second layer on that before the end of this video. And so now we're going to use another technique. It's kind of a combination of the two of these, sort of. It's going to be a wet on wet technique. I'm going to paint this leaf. I have a brush that currently has blue paint on it, so I'm going to use my cup of water to get rid of that blue paint. I'm going to paint wet on dry, so I took a little bit of the paint out of there. On this leaf, I'm going to begin with a wet on dry. I'm going to use this green. I haven't done really much mixing. We did a little bit of mixing, but oftentimes I will mix watercolors. Very rarely do I just use the color that's given. So I've got this green. It's loaded up on my brush. That should be enough to paint this leaf. I'm going to practice control because I just want to go right to the edges. This is one of the reasons why it's important not to leave your brushes bristled down. Is this brush has a pretty good point to it because it hasn't really been damaged. And that allows me to get very controlled as I'm doing the painting. So you can see I'm just filling this leaf in with the paint, practicing that control. Oftentimes I will turn the paper. If I'm making a larger painting, I'll mount it on a board. We'll do some of that in future classes. So I'm just controlling it, going all the way to those corners. I know we've talked about before the pen bleeds, so that ink, what happens is it's dry on the paper, but once this brush touches it, it re-wets and basically becomes ink that's usable again. I kind of like the effect. So I've got a leaf that is wet. Again, you can see the light reflecting on it there. That means it's really wet. And now I'm gonna clean my brush, and I'm going to bring some other colors to it. So this is going to be wet on wet. It's similar to this technique, which hopefully you've watched that video. I'm going to use some yellow and some orange. So I'm just getting some of that yellow on my brush, and I'm just going to touch it. You'll see how it just kind of is expanding there and kind of being an interesting color in there. Some of this leaf, you can see kind of the edge there. It's already dried on the paper, so I'm just going to bring some more of that yellow there. I might touch, just to experiment, a little bit of yellow out in a place where I wouldn't have expected it. And then just to continue this experiment, I'm just going to bring a little bit of orange over to it. I'm not going to do too much, just a little bit. Hold it up closer so that you can see what happens when I do this. So I'm just going to touch some orange out here, maybe on that edge. It's one of the things I really like about watercolors is that when you touch that paint, so that paint there, you can see it's not expanding. That means that where that paint is touching, that paper is dry. So I'm just bringing it over, and so it touches an area that is wet, and then you can see how it just kind of expands in an interesting way. So I'm going to leave that just the way that it is. So now we have practiced 1, 2, 3 different techniques. This was just wet on wet, where it was clean water that we brought color to. Wet on dry, paper was dry, we brought the wet paint with color onto that. And now this was, we started with a color originally that we painted the whole thing with, and we brought more wet paint to that. I'm going to paint another layer on this because it's dried out a little bit. I want to paint the same color so that you can see what happens when you build up layers of paint with watercolor. So I've got this blue. My brush was already wet. I just cleaned it. And now this time I'm practicing my control. So I want to fill about 3/4 of this, and I want to try to go over the lines. So I want to practice the control right to the edge of those marks that I've already made. So you'll see I'm kind of turning the paper and just trying to go over. Like I said, I want to go about 3/4 of the way across. So essentially I'm making a smaller rectangle on the rectangle that already exists. Still practicing that control, bringing it right to the edge. And now I've got 2 layers. I didn't think about it until just this moment, but this is an ocean scene, a very simple ocean scene. So the blue here might be ocean, up there could be a blue sky. So just with 2 layers of watercolor, you can oftentimes create some very interesting effects. All right, thanks for watching, thanks for painting.